Obviously, in the 4 or 5 years since Julia first published the first edition of Where the Truth Lies, the landscape in which we all operate has changed quite fundamentally. And not just the relationship between the media and citizens, but also the relationship between journalism and the industry known as public relations. In those 5 years, social media has become mainstream. Transparency has become the default setting of everything we do. We've seen the rise of owned media channels, the reshaping of content, journalism, ever on the increase, the 24/7 news agenda, and obviously scandals still persist in life, both in politics and in the tabloid world. And perversely, or maybe not perversely, the media is less trusted than ever before. And I think that it's appropriate that we sit here at the top of the Gherkin in the heart of the city when our own Edelman Trust Barometer data will tell you that media sits alongside bankers as the least trusted profession in the country today.
Well, one of the things that's interesting is that the heat is on journalism to prove its trustworthiness and its morality. And of course, 4 or 5 years ago when the book was first published, the boot was on the other foot, and it was all about the pressure was on PR, and PR was spin, and it was public relations and communication that was apparently corrupting, you know, the moral sphere. And of course, a lot of journalism, particularly in these vastly deregulated media markets, are infotainment. And whilst there's nothing wrong with that, that's not necessarily putting truth first.
Truth goes to the heart of what we do at the PCC. Clause 1 of our code is actually all about accuracy, where it's a question of accuracy. We take complaints from anyone because we believe fundamentally that the credibility of the PCC relies to a large extent on our ability to seek the truth.
There is a temptation if you're pursuing someone or something to hope that you can make the case for your own personal point of view. So you've got to really want to make the case, see if you can make a case for the way the world is rather than the way it actually is rather than the way you want it to be. Yeah.
Guido, what kind of media do we have when, in the words of your own blog, tittle, tattle, gossip and rumours form the basis of the truth that you publish?
Profitable media. People want that kind of stuff and I'm there to supply it. It's a market requirement. So I don't have a problem with it being tittle-tattle. It's not Reuters. You know, there's a level of trust you can have in media. If it says rumour and tittle-tattle at the top, you know that this isn't guaranteed 100% absolute truth. But we do our best, and sometimes we make mistakes in the pursuit of truth.
Well, I think we've got a media now where everybody feeds off each other, and particularly the mainstream media is feeding off the internet. And Paul and I had a bit of a disagreement over the William Hague story, where he published this rumour and gave the mainstream media the excuse to report what was just instant tittle-tattle and gossip.
I actually published the facts that they had shared a bedroom.
No,
That's a fact. Not a rumour, that's a fact.
You insinuated a lot more than that. And that's why it became a story. And the fact that then William Hague made, or the Foreign Office made a short statement afterwards, seeking to clarify what had happened, then gave the media the chance to do what they did and then report it as a massive story.
Levels of trust in journalism have never been lower. And in fact, there was a YouGov poll only last week, which produced some quite shocking results, and actually I think quite interesting in this context, because trust in journalism has plummeted to an all-time low. And interestingly, the upmarket, quote, upmarket papers, trust levels were down 24 points to 41%.
I don't think there's anything new about people's trust in journalism being rather low. Back in the 19th century, 18th century, it was not much different, actually. People never really trusted, but they still went out and bought newspapers. They can sift through, to a certain degree, what is truth and what is lies. But I think another thing to throw into the mix of this conversation, which is often at the back of my mind, is what is the motive behind the story? What is the motive of that journalist, that young journalist who's going out there trying to make his or her name? What is the motive when you have publishers, editors all worrying about the bottom line, when circulation levels are falling, there's such competition across the whole media landscape?
That's where the truth lies, is where the buck gets passed and the ownership, and at least with Guido's blog, which I'm a defender of, even though I know it causes great offence and complexity, is he stands up and is counted on what he is doing. And that's very important.
People say, you know, you failed to foresee, the media failed to foresee the financial crash, failed to spot that Saddam Hussein didn't have weapons of mass destruction and so on. These are partly a result of inflated claims for journalism. There are some things, I mean, never mind the weapons of mass destruction for a second, you know, there were journalists who pointed out actually that there were great financial dangers. They just weren't being listened to, and they were in a minority. I think there will be situations, there will always be situations, in which the media is not necessarily going to be able to foretell the future with perfect accuracy.
I am in pursuit of hidden truths. I think, serious stories that hit the front pages regularly, and I do a lot of stuff because I realise I'm in the infotainment business. You know, there's a lot of fun stories that amuse, and I go by Kelvin Mackenzie's advice that, you know, you've got to either amuse them, anger them, or inform them. If you do one of those three things, gotcha. And that's what I want to do. But it doesn't take away from the fact that I always remember I've got to have an audience, a popular audience.
I'm Lucy Huberman. I'm Professor of Digital Media at the University of Warwick. Like Julia, I'm very interested in what she describes as the nuanced truth. Where there are nuances is, for example, how the digital content of the press is regulated, and also when newspapers publish screenshots, photos, quotes, blogs on their pages, is that counting still as digital content? Is it ever sourced?
We should never take anything at face value. The test of any source is whether the source is in a position to know what he or she has told you.
Remember the evening David Laws resigned from the cabinet back in May? I was actually in the BBC newsroom about to do something on the news channel, and I learned that he was about to resign. Now, I considered the source that I had reasonable, so I put it on my Twitter feed, did a short blog post about it, and I said to the news editor, I said, have you heard this? David Laws is about to resign. It sent the entire BBC newsroom into blind panic. It took them an hour and a quarter to stand that up and get a second source. They would not put that on air until they actually had that second source.
Quite right too.
Well, I'm not saying it isn't quite right, but I, as a blogger, was quite happy to rely on that single source because I knew that it was, well, I hoped that it was accurate. I did slightly panic when it took the BBC an hour and a quarter.
You know, the mainstream media needs to keep up. Yeah. It's ridiculous, the idea that the BBC can't get a story in under an hour and a half that's out there. That's just not right.
Can I just correct something that someone's just tweeted? It says, I have said I only need one source. I needed one source on that David Laws story. I'm not saying I go with every story with one source. I just want to clarify that.
When the Pope came here, we were fascinated as to how the media handled this, because, if I may be allowed to suggest, his great message was warning about the spirit of the issues of which you were talking about, because your entire media machine was totally wrapped up in its own cogwheels, pursuing scandals to report stories. There were very important issues there. So someone said to me the other day, we've got the best media in the world. And I said, no. I said, we have the worst media in the world, but we have among the finest journalists, the finest journalists.
I mean, I don't think your formulation makes sense. And more to the point, I absolutely disagree with you about the reporting of the Pope's visit, which I actually thought was really quite good. I mean, I declare an interest. I'm not a Roman Catholic, but I think it's a papal visit is a very interesting test of news media because it's big ideas, it's an unfamiliar subject for most journalists, and at the same time, there was a rolling news story boiling alongside the sexual abuse scandals. I actually thought that buried in there, if you can find it, was some really extremely good reporting. It was an original, freshly done, calmly done. You had to look for it, but then in today's media ecology, you have to do that.
And finally, thank you to the panel for participating in what I hope has been an illuminating discussion. Thanks very much.